All right, folks, we're going to get started here with chapter 24 and a little pop art for you. Here's our sections, and we'll start with the first one, and here's your focus question. A golden age of capitalism followed World War II, in which economic expansion, stable prices, low unemployment, and rising living standards characterized American economic life until 1973. In every measurable way, most Americans lived better than had their parents and grandparents. By 1960, a majority of Americans were defined by the government as middle class, and the poverty rate had dropped to 1 in 5 families. Innovations like television, air conditioners, dishwashers, cheap long-distance phone calls, and jet air travel came into widespread use, and former luxuries like electricity and indoor plumbing became common features for many Americans. Further, between 1950 and 1973, the average real wages of manufacturing workers doubled, and wages rose faster for low-income than high-income Americans, lessening economic inequality. This model of widespread affluence was made possible by government policies, a strong union movement, and the country's global economic dominance in the wake of World War II. When the boom ended in 1973, it would be succeeded by an even longer period of stagnant incomes for most Americans, increasing inequality. Although the economies of Western Europe and Japan recovered after the war, the United States remained the world's industrial superpower. Major industries like steel, automobiles, and aircraft dominated the American and world markets, and like other wars, the Cold War increased industrial production and redistributed population and resources. The West became a center of military technology production, and the South housed military bases and shipyards. In New England, new aircraft and submarine production replaced some of the jobs lost by the movement of textiles to the South. But the 1950s were, in fact, the last years of America's industrial age. Ever since, the U.S. economy has moved toward services, education, information, finance, and entertainment, while employment in manufacturing has dropped. Union-led wage raises caused many employers to turn to mechanizing production in order to reduce labor costs. The number of farms in America declined as well, even as new technologies in irrigation increased agricultural production. Changes in southern agriculture continue to reduce the number of agricultural laborers, 3 million of whom, both black and white, left the South. Through the labor of Latino and Filipino migrant laborers, once luxuries like apples and oranges became an everyday crop grown in Texas, Arizona, and especially California. What most spurred economic growth in the 1950s was housing construction and spending on consumer goods. The post-war baby boom and population migration from cities to suburbs created demand for housing, televisions, home appliances, and cars. By 1960, there were more suburban residents of single-family homes than people living in urban or rural areas. In the 1950s, the number of houses doubled, most of them built in suburbs. Many Americans now realize dreams of owning their own homes by purchasing an inexpensive house in a housing development. William and Alfred Levitt built the first Levittown on Long Island and soon became the most famous suburban developers. Houses were affordable and assembled quickly from prefabricated parts, making them desirable for middle-class Americans. But suburbs were often centered around malls, which were accessible only by cars and were used for shopping and other private activities, unlike city centers with multiple uses. California best symbolized the post-war suburban boom. Between World War II and 1975, more than 30 million Americans moved west of the Mississippi River. One-fifth of the 1950s population growth happened in California, and in 1963 it surpassed New York as the most populous state. Centerless western cities emerged, such as Houston, Phoenix, and Los Angeles. These were decentralized clusters of single-family homes and businesses tied together by highways, unlike eastern cities with central business districts and surrounding residential areas united by public transportation. In the new suburbs, life revolved around the car. People drove to work and drove to shop, and older city centers stagnated. Suburban homes required lawns, so much so that today more land in the United States is cultivated in grass than in agricultural crops. Affluence and consumerism had never before so pervaded American society. In a consumer culture, freedom became the ability to satisfy market desires. The 1950s was the culmination of a long-term trend in which consumerism replaced economic independence and democratic participation as central definitions of American freedom. Americans now happily accumulated debt in order to maintain a consumer lifestyle. Consumer culture also demonstrated the superiority of the American way of life to communism, and American goods, like Coca Cola, were marketed to countries overseas as the Cold War's most powerful weapon. Television especially spread the culture of middle class American life and consumerism. By 1960, almost all American families owned a TV set, and television replaced newspapers as the most common information source about public events. TV became the nation's primary leisure activity. It changed Americans' habits and offered Americans of all backgrounds a common experience. TV programming almost always avoided controversy and depicted a humdrum middle class existence. Early TV shows that featured urban working class families were supplanted by quiz shows, westerns, and comedies set in suburbia, such as Leave It to Beaver. TV also became the most effective advertising medium ever, selling goods and spreading an image of the good life as one based on consumer goods. Buying a new car seemed essential soon to to freedom, and along with the home and the TV, became a consumer necessity for each family. By 1960, 4 out of 5 families in the U.S. owned at least one car, almost always made in America. Auto manufacturers and oil companies became the top companies in America. Detroit became the center of the auto industry, sporting enormous factories with 40,000 or more employees. The River Road complex had 62,000 employees. The car transformed American life. The interstate highway system changed Americans' traveling habits, enabling long-distance vacations by car. The result was an altered landscape of motels, drive-ins, strip malls, movie theaters, and roadside restaurants, including fast food enterprises like McDonald's, which opened in Illinois in 1954. The car was an icon of American freedom, representing individual mobility and private choice. Suburbanization reinforced the family as the center of the American way of life and women's household roles. Most women who had industrial jobs during the war lost them, and most women who worked outside the home remained in low paying, non union jobs rather than better paid factory jobs. Although the number of women at work slowly rose, more women worked to supplant their families' consumer lifestyle than for economic independence, and their pay in 1960 was, on average, 60% of men's pay. It was widely assumed that the suburban family's breadwinner should be male, while the wife stayed at home. Popular culture depicted marriage as the most important life goal of the American woman, and women married younger, divorced less, and had more children. A baby boom lasted from the war's end to the mid 1960s, contributing to an increase of 30 million in the nation's population in the 1950s. Further medical advancements, such as the availability of penicillin, aided Americans in living longer than ever before. And the family became a weapon in the Cold War, as government officials argued that women's confinement to the home separated the free world from the communist world where women worked. Feminism seemed to have disappeared from American life and culture. The idea of domestic life as a women's sphere had a long history in the United States, but in the post-war suburbs, it came close to realization. The suburbs offered the dream of home ownership and security to millions of Americans who had suffered through the Depression and war. It also promoted Americanization as ethnic Americans left urban enclaves and joined an America of mass consumption. Though critics and celebrants emphasized their uniformity, the reality was that suburbs vary widely based on class. This resulted in vast differences in the quality of services offered from one suburb to another. The suburbs were also racially segregated. Although they differed in many ways, suburbs were almost always white. As late as the 1990s, nearly 90% of suburban whites lived in communities with non-white populations of less than 1%. The racial segregation of suburbanization was the result of decisions by government, real estate developers, banks, and residents. In the post-war housing boom, government officials ensured mortgages that barred resale to non-whites. Even when this practice was declared unconstitutional in 1948, private banks and developers, including William Levitt, continued to do so. Although Congress in 1949 passed a law to build more than 800,000 units of public housing, the law set a very low ceiling on residents' income in order to limit competition for the construction of middle-class housing on behalf of private contractors. The terms of the law limited housing projects to the very poor. Along with the fact that white urban and suburban neighborhoods opposed the construction of public housing, this reinforced the poverty of urban non-white areas. Urban renewal also demolished poor neighborhoods and city centers in order to develop shopping centers, all-white middle-income residential areas, and state university campuses. Whites displaced by urban renewal often moved to suburbs, but non-whites were unable to leave the inner city. Native Americans were among those moving to inner cities in part due to the 1952 Indian Urban Relocation Program, which promised good jobs, housing, and schools. However, conditions rarely lived up to promises as Native Americans were housed in some of the poorest inner city neighborhoods with few job prospects and sparse federal aid. Though Native Americans moved into urban areas in larger numbers, the program was critiqued as one in a long line of efforts to diminish tribal identities. While the program relocated many Native Americans away from reservations, it also fostered a new generation of pan Indian nationalists who reasserted the importance of land and sovereignty as the basis of Indian freedom. Suburbanization reinforced racial divisions in America. Between 1950 and 1970, almost 7 million whites left cities for suburbs, while 3 million blacks moved from the south to the north, expanding and creating urban ghettos. 500,000 Puerto Ricans, many of them small farmers and laborers pushed off the island by sugar companies, moved to the mainland, and many settled in East Harlem and New York City. By the late 1960s, more Puerto Ricans lived in New York City than in San Juan, the island's capital. Racial exclusion reinforced itself. Non-whites facing employment discrimination and exclusion from educational opportunities were confined to unskilled jobs. As whites and industrial jobs moved out of the cities, poor blacks and Latinos stayed in the urban ghettos, which became seen as centers of crime, poverty, and welfare. Suburban whites feared that any non-white presence in their neighborhoods would lower their quality of life and property values. Residential segregation was reinforced by blockbusting, a tactic of real estate brokers who circulated exaggerated warnings of an influx of non-whites to persuade white residents to sell their homes quickly. Suburban homeownership long remained a white entitlement with racial barriers in housing, and therefore public education and jobs reinforced. While many of these issues would spawn protests in the 1960s, to many observers in the 1950s it seemed that the ills of American society had been solved. If problems remained, their solutions required technical adjustments, not structural change or aggressive political intervention. Both Protestant and Roman Catholic leaders spread anti-communism in the Cold War culture, in which the nation's religiosity was celebrated. During the 1950s, a majority of Americans, the highest percentage in American history, were affiliated with a church or a synagogue. In 1954, Congress added the words "under God" to the Pledge of Allegiance, and in 1957, "In God We Trust" was added to paper money. Hollywood movies like The Ten Commandments celebrated early Judaism and Christianity. Religious leaders used radio and television to spread to millions a religious message heavily imbued with anti-communism. Religious differences now seemed absorbed into a common Judeo-Christian heritage in which Catholics, Protestants, and Jews all shared history and values and contributed to American society. And freedom of religion was held to differentiate America from the anti-religious Soviet Union. Although the Judeo-Christian concept obscured the long-standing history of religious strife in American life, it reflected the decline of anti-Catholicism and anti-Semitism in the United States and increasing secularization in the nation. Although a majority of Americans were affiliated with a church or synagogue, religion had more to do with personal identity, group assimilation, and promoting traditional morality than spiritual activity. Cold War freedom's economic content became centered on consumer capitalism or free enterprise. An economic system based on private ownership united the nations of the free world more than political democracy or freedom of speech. Even President Truman replaced mentions of freedom from want and fear in his speeches with freedom of enterprise. The selling of free enterprise became a major industry that involved advertising, school programs, newspaper editorials, and civic activities. Yet talk of the virtue of free markets ignored how government policies like federal tax subsidies, mortgage guarantees, infrastructure construction, military contracts, and GI Bill benefits all spurred post-war economic growth. Although Americans had long worried that big business threatened their liberties, they were now told by government officials to embrace large-scale production as a way to fight the Cold War and enhance freedom by spreading consumer goods. Freedom was defined essentially as freedom of choice for the consumer. To many, America seemed to have become a classless society. A steep rise in the number of people investing in Wall Street inspired talk of a people's capitalism. In 1953, 4.5 million Americans owned shares of stock. By the mid-1960s, that number rose to 25 million. Few could deny that affluence seemed to make poverty a relic of history. In the 1950s, a few intellectuals began to revive conservatism and reclaim from liberals the idea of freedom. Their ideas eventually defined conservative thought for the rest of the 20th century. Their opposition to a strong national government was fostered by resentments against the New Deal. These libertarian conservatives defined freedom as individual autonomy, limited government, and unregulated capitalism. Their principles appealed to conservative entrepreneurs, especially in the developing South and West. Many businessmen looking to earn profits free of government regulations, high taxes, and unions admired the writings of Milton Friedman. A young economist, Friedman, in 1962 published Capitalism and Freedom, which identified the free market as the foundation of individual liberty. Friedman gave this rather popular idea an extreme logic. He called for privatizing almost all government functions and for the repeal of minimum wage laws, the graduated income tax, and Social Security. Friedman criticized not only liberalism, but also the new conservatism, another growing body of 1950s thought. Believing that the free world had to be morally and intellectually and not just militarily defended against communism, writers like Russell Kirk and Richard Weaver argued that liberals' tolerations of difference was no substitute for the search for absolute truth. They called for a return to a civilization based on Christian values. They understood freedom as, above all, a moral condition in which individuals were responsible for their own actions and could be coerced by government if they did not make the right decisions. Although the libertarian conservatives and the new conservatives disagreed about priorities and the definition of freedom, they both united against the Soviet Union and liberalism at home. Conservatism in America was now defined by its opposition to big government. Republican control of the presidency did not lessen conservative hostility toward the federal government, and many did not consider Eisenhower one of their own. So that was our first question. We'll be back with the second one here in a few minutes.